I'm going to tell you the story of the largest flying machine the world has ever seen, the Hindenburg. Picture a 14-year-old boy, a plate in his hand, washing dishes in the officer's mess. Suddenly the ship shudders. The massive water tank above him bursts and it soaks him from head to toe. That soaking will save his life, because 30 seconds later, the ship he's standing on, the largest flying machine the world has ever seen, will turn into a fireball in the sky. 35 people will die, but that boy, thanks to the water that fell on him, will walk out of the wreckage without a single scratch. Was it a coincidence? And what really happened in that sky that night? In 1936, a building rose into the sky, except this one had learned to fly. Its name was the Hindenburg. Its length, 245 meters. Line up 3 Boeing 747s end to end and you still wouldn't reach it. Its diameter, 41 meters. Inside there were dining rooms, a reading room, even a specially built aluminum piano weighing only 356 kilograms, an engineering marvel for its time. The walls were covered in elegant paintings depicting different regions of Germany. The tables held fine porcelain plates and crystal glasses, as if a hotel had been built in the sky. Passengers spent their nights in comfortable cabins, ate breakfast above the clouds, and could light a cigar in the smoking lounge in the afternoon. Yes, inside a giant hydrogen tank, in a separate, tightly sealed, double-doored, pressurized room, there was still a smoking lounge. In the kitchen, cooks served fresh-baked bread, hot soups, even roasted meat from time to time. It crossed the same route as ocean liners in half the time, Frankfurt to New York in 3 days. Even the fastest transatlantic ship took twice as long. The company that built the ship had been manufacturing Zeppelins for years. Its predecessor, the Graf Zeppelin, had been flying without incident for over a decade, even completing world tours. The Hindenburg was the pinnacle of that experience, the largest flying machine ever built and a source of pride for Germany. The massive red, white, black swastika symbols on its tail fins showed that the ship was no longer just a mode of transportation, but a propaganda tool. The Nazi regime used the Hindenburg to display Germany's power to the world. What kept this ship in the air was hydrogen. 16 large gas cells hidden inside a cotton envelope, all filled with hydrogen, about 200,000 cubic meters of gas in total. Hydrogen was light, with tremendous lifting power, but it was also one of the most flammable gases known to man. The engineers knew this. They had actually wanted to use helium, a non-flammable, safe gas, but nearly all the world's helium was produced in America, which held 80% of the global supply. A law passed in 1927 had halted helium exports due to scarcity, an ordinary economic decision that had nothing to do with a war that was still years away. But the result was the same. The Germans, whether they wanted to or not, had to fly on hydrogen. The Hindenburg's outer surface was silver. The aluminum powder coated onto the fabric reflected sunlight and kept the gas inside from heating up. Beneath that gleaming, elegant hull, a massive tank of flammable gas was flying. No one saw it as a danger. Zeppelins had been flying on hydrogen for 30 years, and most landed and took off without incident. The Hindenburg itself had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times without a problem up to that point. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg was on its first North American flight of the season. It had departed from Frankfurt and was due to land at Naval Air Station Lakehurst in New Jersey. There were 97 people on board, 36 passengers, 61 crew. Most of the passengers were businessmen, journalists, or curious wealthy travelers. This was still an expensive, prestigious way to travel. In those years, Zeppelins could do something airplanes still couldn't: comfortable, safe, long-distance passenger transport. In 1929, the Graf Zeppelin had circled the entire globe in 21 days, stopping along the way but almost without interruption. In 1936, at the opening of the Berlin Olympics, the Hindenburg had flown low over the stadium, trailing the five-ringed flag, an image that became one of the era's most striking aerial displays. But the airship age was never accident-free. In 1930, the British airship R-101 crashed into a hill in France and caught fire, killing 48 people. In 1933, the American airship USS Akron went down in a storm over the Atlantic, killing 73 of the 76 people aboard, the deadliest airship disaster up to that time. Both accidents were talked about for days in the world press, then forgotten. What set the Hindenburg apart from every previous accident was something new: cameras. That evening in Lakehurst, there were both newswire photographers and film crews shooting for newsreels. For the first time, people would witness a disaster in real time, on film. The giant swastikas on the Hindenburg's tail fins were no accident. The Nazi regime had come to power while the ship was still under construction, and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels immediately recognized its symbolic power. The Hindenburg's first major assignment, before its scientific test flights were even complete, was a 4-day propaganda tour. The ship flew over Germany, blasting marches from loudspeakers and dropping pro-Hitler leaflets over cities. The captain who led that flight would later call it a shit flight, but at the time there was no room to object. That same year, the Hindenburg flew low over the stadium at the opening of the Berlin Olympics, displaying the 5 Olympic rings. The ship wasn't just a mode of transport, it was a flying billboard advertising Germany's power to the world. Among the crew was a 14-year-old mess boy, Werner Franz. His family was going through hard times. His father, a hotel switchboard operator, had fallen ill and could no longer work. His mother struggled to hold the household together alone, while his 16-year-old brother Günther worked as an apprentice waiter at a well-known Frankfurt hotel. But his wages weren't enough for the family. A Hindenburg captain who was staying at that hotel heard about the family's situation and offered young Werner a job on board. And so, a 14-year-old boy became a mess boy serving officers on the largest flying machine in the world. This was his 4th transatlantic crossing. He had already flown 3 times to South America and once to North America. Despite his young age, he was considered experienced aboard the ship by now. He knew which corridor led where and which officer liked what. On the evening of May 6th, the weather over New Jersey was bad. Storm clouds had gathered with occasional flashes of lightning. Captain Max Pruss circled the ship along the coast for 3 hours, waiting for the weather to clear. Passengers passed the time watching the Manhattan skyline through the windows, then the distant lightning. Just after 7 in the evening, landing clearance came from the ground. The wind was still shifting, but there was no more time to wait. Werner was in the officers' mess at the time, clearing away the dinner dishes. Outside, the ship was slowly descending. Mooring lines were being lowered, and the ground crew waited to catch them. Dozens of people, journalists, photographers, curious onlookers, had gathered at the edge of the field, watching the ship's landing. It looked like an ordinary landing, even a little dull. Around 7:25 p.m., a witness spotted a small flame at the top of the ship's tail. Hard to notice at first, like a faint shimmer. 32 seconds later, the Hindenburg was entirely engulfed in fire. 3 days had passed since departing Frankfurt. The ship was crossing the Atlantic at roughly 125 kilometers per hour, faster or slower depending on the ocean winds. Passengers spent these 3 days less like an ordinary voyage and more like a stay at a floating hotel. Mornings brought breakfast in the dining room. In the afternoons, passengers sat by the wide windows watching the ocean below, sometimes the ships they passed. In the evenings, a small orchestra played and passengers danced. Yes, even aboard a ship filled with hydrogen, there was a dance floor. For the Doehner children, the journey had been a bit dull. They missed the wide decks and play areas of ocean liners, since space aboard the Zeppelin was far more limited. Still, their mother had brought games to keep them entertained, and the crew let the children tour the control car and the outer corridors near the engines, an unusual privilege for the time. Most of the voyage passed without incident, but over the middle of the Atlantic, the ship flew into a storm band, shaking for a few hours before calming again. No one saw it as a warning sign. Zeppelins were used to flying through bad weather. As they approached the New Jersey coast, excitement had been building. Passengers crowded the windows, pointing out the American shoreline as it appeared below, then the Manhattan skyline. None of them knew that within a few hours they would live through the worst moment of their lives, for some their last. 7:25 p.m. The ship was roughly 90 meters above the ground, mooring lines lowered, the ground crew preparing to catch them. Everything looked normal. Passengers gathered at the windows, waving to those who'd come to greet them. Then, at the top of the ship's tail, a small flame appeared, hard to notice at first, like a reflection of sunlight. Within seconds, the flame grew, and the hydrogen inside ignited with the speed of a spark. The ship's stern collapsed, the bow suddenly pitched upward, and the entire 245-meter frame began falling to the ground like a burning cage. Those on the ground saw a giant orange ball in the sky, as if night had suddenly turned to day. The light was so intense it could be seen for miles. The hundreds of people waiting at the edge of the field froze for a moment, then screaming and chaos broke out. Some ran toward the ship to help, others ran away. The entire process, from that small flame to the ship's complete collapse, took just 32 seconds, barely long enough for a person to hold their breath a few times. On the ground, a young radio reporter was recording. His name was Herbert Morrison, 31 years old, a broadcaster from Chicago's WLS radio, with sound engineer Charlie Nelson at his side. Their job was simply to describe the ship's calm landing, a routine assignment. But the words coming out of his microphone became something else entirely. The back motors of the ship are just holding it enough to keep it from, it burst into flames. It burst into flames and it's falling, ladies and gentlemen. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. There's smoke, there's flame, and the frame is crashing to the ground now. Oh, the humanity, all those passengers. I can't believe it. That recording would become, years later, one of the most recognized moments in radio history. But no one heard it live that evening. Radio stations at the time had banned using recordings in live broadcasts. The recording only aired the next day, once permission was granted. Morrison's voice was breaking, at moments nearly in tears, but he didn't drop the microphone. When the shock wave from the explosion knocked the recording needle off the disc, the engineer beside him instantly reset it. Without that split-second reflex, this historic recording could have been lost forever. Before the fire died down, Morrison continued reporting from the scene for nearly 40 minutes, pausing several times to drop the microphone and run into the burning wreckage to help injured passengers. While running toward the wreckage, he grabbed a girl by the arm. She shouted at him, "Let me go. I have to find my father." Morrison asked her to stay calm. "Tell me his name. If he survived, I'll broadcast it so your mother will know he's safe." The girl gave her father's name and ran on. That name was among the first survivors' names broadcast. Her father was alive. Werner Franz was inside the ship at the time, in the officers' mess. When the ship shuddered, he didn't fully understand what was happening. He heard a thud, as if the ship's tail had suddenly struck the ground and the ship tilted sharply upward. Moments later, a large water ballast tank above him burst, drenching him from head to toe. That water would save his life. As hydrogen flames roared above and behind him, the wetness covering him bought him a few critical seconds, a thin but vital buffer against the heat. He didn't panic. He kicked open a cloth supply hatch used for loading provisions and threw himself into the gap as the ship neared the ground. The moment he hit the ground, he made a conscious decision within seconds. He ran into the wind, away from the direction the flames were being pushed. If he had run the other way, the flames would have caught him. Werner Franz walked away from the wreckage without a single scratch. After the ship collapsed to the ground, the field was in complete chaos. Some of the ground crew personnel ran toward the burning wreckage without thinking of their own safety. Some tried to beat out the flames with their bare hands. Others dragged the injured out. Ambulances and fire trucks reached the scene within minutes, but were overwhelmed by the scale of the wreckage. Nearby hospitals were suddenly flooded with dozens of severe burn patients. Most of the survivors were in shock. Some walked around feeling nothing. Others had collapsed to the ground, trying to understand what had happened. People with burned clothes and singed hair moved away from the field, some in silence, some screaming. Photographers and news crews kept their cameras running, capturing footage that would go down in history. Some of them couldn't hold back tears while doing so. Most of those who survived had, just minutes earlier, been living the final moments of an ordinary journey. Now, they carried with them a memory they would bear for the rest of their lives. There was another family aboard, the Doehners. They lived in Mexico City, where Father Herman worked as an executive at a pharmaceutical company. They were returning home after visiting relatives in Germany. Mother Matilda, 14-year-old daughter Irene, 10-year-old son Walter, and the youngest, 8-year-old Werner. The voyage had been dull for the children. Their mother had brought games to keep them occupied and let them tour the control car and the ship's skeletal corridors. As they approached Lakehurst, the father was filming the view below with his movie camera. Then he put the camera down and went back to their cabin. "We didn't see him again," Werner would recount 80 years later. When the ship caught fire, the Doehner family was near a window. The mother first grabbed her older son Walter and threw him out the window. Then she caught little Werner, threw herself backward, and pushed him out too. She tried to do the same with her daughter Irene, but the girl, now 14, was too heavy. Time was running out. The ship was nearly touching the ground. The mother herself jumped out at the last moment, breaking her hip. On the ground, crawling with her broken hip, she reached a steward and begged him to pull her daughter from the wreckage. The steward dove into the flames and carried Irene out, but the girl, from the burns she'd suffered, died before morning. Little Werner lay on the ground, unable to understand what had happened. His brother Walter, with burns on his face and hand, pulled him up. "Get up, we have to get out of here." Both survived with serious burns. Their mother joined them, and the three were taken together by bus to the infirmary. When the family returned to Mexico City, they held 2 funerals, for their father and for their older sister. Werner Doehner didn't speak of that night to anyone until he was in his 80s. His son Bernie would later say, "It was definitely a repressed memory. He lost his father, he lost his sister." Werner grew up to become an electrical engineer, settled in America, started a family, but he kept the memory of the Hindenburg to himself well into his 80s. When he finally began to speak, he left behind a final testimony. His story and Werner Franz's story together showed the 2 faces of the disaster. One, a mess boy who escaped without a scratch. The other, an 8-year-old boy who would carry his scars for the rest of his life. When he died in 2019 at the age of 90, Werner Doehner was the last living survivor of the Hindenburg's 62. That evening, there were 97 people aboard the ship. 35 died, 22 crew, 13 passengers, and 1 ground worker also lost his life. 62 survived. Statistically, this was a higher survival rate than many people would assume, because the ship was already low, in landing position, and the flames spread slowly, layer by layer, rather than exploding all at once like a bomb. Most of the survivors were people who thought quickly, or who happened to be in the right place. Businessman Nelson Morris and his associate Bertus Doehner were watching the lightning from the starboard lounge when the ship suddenly dropped sharply. Both leapt into the burning girders. Morris survived. Doehner became trapped in the wreckage and couldn't be saved. In the years after his friend's death, Morris continued to provide financial support to his family, one survivor's sense of responsibility toward the friend he lost. There was also an acrobat aboard, Joseph Spa, a vaudeville performer known by his stage name. As the ship fell, he hung out of a window, clinging to the outside of the hull, and jumped once close enough to the ground with an acrobat's reflexes. He also tried to save the dog he'd brought aboard, but couldn't reach the animal in time. Some of the crew risked their own escape to help passengers. Chief Steward Heinrich Kubis personally carried several passengers out of the flames on his shoulders. He was later honored with a medal for his courage. Captain Max Pruss remained at his post in the control car. He suffered severe burns as the ship collapsed but survived, and testified about the disaster for years afterward. Some passengers survived without any heroics at all, simply by being in the right place at the right time. Sitting near a window, standing close to a door, could mean the difference between life and death. There was also a writer couple aboard, Leonhard and Gertrude Adelt from Berlin. Both were journalists, traveling to America for a series of articles. When the ship caught fire, they were in different parts of the ship. Gertrude survived. Leonhard did not. Years later, Gertrude would write a book about that evening and the loss of her husband, a woman who made her living with words, trying once more to put into words the most inexplicable moment of her life. The cause of the disaster was debated for years. American and German investigations, conducted separately, reached similar conclusions. The stormy weather that evening had built up a static charge in the atmosphere, and at some point that charge discharged as a spark, igniting the leaking hydrogen. Scientists called it a brush discharge, a small but lethal electrical release. But the press couldn't wait. Before the wreckage had even cooled, New York newspapers began publishing 5, then 6 different theories, from engine failure to lightning, from an explosive device to sabotage. One of the crew members who died, a young fabric worker named Eric Spale, was accused for years of being the secret saboteur. The claim even became the subject of a book, then a film. In the film, the attacker's name was even changed, but everyone knew who was meant. Spale never had the chance to defend himself because he was one of those who died that evening. The voice that might have spoken against the accusation was silenced forever. 80 years of scientific research has never confirmed the sabotage claim. The most likely explanation remains the same: bad weather, accumulated static electricity, and a leaking gas. Not a deliberate act of malice, but a string of unfortunate physical conditions coming together. Even decades after the disaster, scientists never stopped studying the Hindenburg. Modern engineers reconstructed the event frame by frame, examining surviving fragments of the ship's fabric covering, along with photographs and film footage from the period. Chemistry labs tested whether the coating material used at the time was really as extremely flammable as believed. The result was surprising. The fabric itself wasn't as dangerous as people thought. The real issue had never changed: the gas that carried the ship. Roughly 200,000 cubic meters of hydrogen could turn into a fireball within seconds from a single spark. Modern root cause analyses reached the same conclusion. When the static electrical charge created by the stormy weather met the leaking hydrogen, disaster became unavoidable. This was a story of the laws of physics, not of deliberate sabotage. Herbert Morrison's story continued after that evening, too. The guilt he felt during the disaster never fully left him. Even years later, he would explain that he had shouted, "Oh, the humanity," because he believed everyone aboard had died. In fact, 62 people had survived. When the recording aired the next day, listeners heard those words once more, and overnight, Morrison became known in history as the voice of the disaster. Because the recording device had run slightly slow, Morrison's voice sounded thin and high-pitched on the recording, when in reality, his voice was deep and calm, typical of a radio announcer of the era. Listeners always remembered him by that high, panicked voice. It was an image that did him a disservice for the rest of his career. Morrison served as a pilot during World War II, then returned to journalism and became the first news director at a television station in Pittsburgh. In 1975, he served as a technical advisor on a film about the Hindenburg. When he died in 1989 at the age of 83, his wife said of him, "He was a quiet, unassuming man, but he was always proud that he was able to give that broadcast." The burning of the Hindenburg was one of the first major disasters ever captured on film from start to finish. Weeks earlier, that same footage had simply been an advertisement for a technological marvel. Now it became a disaster documentary, watched in fear in every cinema in the world. Those images traveled the globe, and overnight, the age of passenger Zeppelins came to an end. After that date, no commercial passenger hydrogen airship ever flew again. Decades of engineering tradition were buried in history in 32 seconds. Interestingly, the Hindenburg wasn't even history's deadliest airship accident. 4 years earlier, in 1933, the helium-filled American airship USS Akron had gone down in a storm, killing 73 of its 76 crew. Far more deaths than the Hindenburg. But almost no one remembers that disaster, because there were no cameras there. What carved the Hindenburg into history wasn't the death toll. It was the power of the footage and Herbert Morrison's breaking voice. The Zeppelin company completed a sister ship, the Graf Zeppelin II, but it never carried passengers. It only flew a handful of test and propaganda flights before being locked away in hangars once World War II broke out. In 1940, citing the need for war materials, both Zeppelins were scrapped, their aluminum frames melted down for warplanes. Giants that had once been the most elegant vehicles in the sky became, within a few years, a footnote in history. Werner Franz returned to Germany shortly afterward. During the war years, he worked first as an aviation technician, then as a radio operator. After the war, he spent the rest of his life as an ice and roller skating coach. He even coached Marika Kilius and her partner, who would later become world champions. He gave interviews about the disaster for years, always telling the same detail, the bursting of the water tank and the decision to run into the wind. In 2004, in his 70s, he returned to Lakehurst. At what is now a museum on that base, he looked at photographs of his own survival. When he died in 2014 at the age of 92, he was the last surviving member of the Hindenburg's crew. 5 years later, in 2019, little Werner Doehner also passed away at 90, and with him, the last living witnesses of that evening passed into history. The Hindenburg now lives on only in archival footage, in records, and in the stories told about it. We remember the 36 people who lost their lives that evening. 22 crew members, 13 passengers, and 1 worker on the ground doing his job. Each of them had a family, a story, people they left behind, and every one of them had simply set out that evening on a journey through the sky, whether for work or out of curiosity. Let's return to the question we asked at the start. Was the water that fell on Werner Franz a coincidence, or did he somehow know something? The answer is neither, or perhaps a little of both. The water tank bursting directly above him was pure chance. No one planned it. No one could have foreseen it. But what he did after being soaked was no longer chance, not panicking, finding the right hatch, running in the right direction. Those were his decisions. Fate gave him a chance. He made the most of it. That same night, on that same ship, there were 36 people who weren't given the same chance. Their story shows us that sometimes even the most careful engineering Even the most loving mother cannot outrun fate. But for those left behind, for Werner Franz, for Werner Doehner, for Gertrude Adelt, life went on after those 32 seconds. Some carried it by speaking of it, others in silence. Sometimes survival isn't decided by courage, but by a single second of chance, by where a water tank happens to burst, by which direction you happen to run. What's most striking about Werner Franz's story is perhaps not the coincidence at all. It's the ability to think clearly, even in the middle of panic. With flames surrounding him on every side, he still managed to calculate which way to run. And the Doehner family's story teaches us something else. A mother, even in her final seconds, thinking of her children first. How a single decision can shape the rest of a life. This story reminds us of one more thing. Even the greatest feats of engineering can be undone by a small, invisible spark. But at the same time, even in the darkest moments, some people choose to help others. Morrison dropping his microphone to run into the wreckage. Kubis carrying passengers on his shoulders. A mother pushing her children out a window. 32 seconds was enough to change the course of a life. For some, a disaster. For some, a miracle. For some, a silence they carried for the rest of their lives.